Hello everyone and welcome to the FTA Thought Leadership webinar. My name is Tine Humara. I am a membership officer here at the FTA and I will be the moderator of this webinar. This webinar will focus on labor brokers, and in a couple of minutes my colleague Veronica Rubio will continue on with the discussion. But before we start, I just want to check, can everybody hear me? Okay, that's great. Let's start with the webinar. Before we get started, I just want to share some technical details with you. So by default, your microphones will be muted to ensure the best quality of the sound. However, if you want to raise a question or if you want to share something with the audience and the panel, you can always add your question in the chat box that you will see on the right-hand side. This session will take around 1 hour, and you will have a Q&A session in the last 15 minutes. Please also make sure to follow us on social media, especially on Twitter. If you found this webinar to be interesting, we can always continue our discussion on Twitter, while you can follow us at FTA_INTL. That's what we're going to do today. So I will do a short introduction of the people who are here to explain to all of you what Labor Brokers is about. We will then, after the panel discussion, as before, we will have a 15-minute Q&A, and afterwards we'll have a wrap-up and closing. If you have any further questions after the webinar, you can always send us an email at info@fta-intl.org. Now to continue on to the speakers. The moderator of the discussion is Veronica Rubio. She is the Senior Manager of Strategic Programs at the FTA, and she is a lawyer specialized in international trade and human rights. Now, for the last 17 years, she has worked promoting sustainable supply chains, social corporate responsibility, and small farmers' access to the international fair trade markets. She has very solid experience in developing certification standards and code of conduct. Currently, Veronica is also the lead at our BCI Sustainability Wine Program. Our first panelist is Clara Pascual de Vargas. Clara is a human rights officer at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Prior to joining the OHCHR, she worked for the International Organization for Migration, where she focused on the development of IRIS, which is a voluntary standard for recruitment intermediaries, and also in the promotion of migrant workers' rights in global supply chains. Our second panelist is Christina Aarskov-Björling. Christina monitors the implementation of BCI's and Axfood's Code of Conduct in their supply chain. Axfood is actually one of the largest food retailers in Sweden, with over 400 suppliers in more than 40 countries. Christina also has a background in the NGO sector, in which she worked at Sweatwatch for 12 years as a researcher focusing on human rights in supply chains. Our final panelist is Patrick Nijts. Patrick is a senior advisor and managing partner of Vectra International. Patrick has held senior management positions with environment, health and safety, and corporate responsibility in the pharmaceutical, life sciences, and also at a major textile company, who was actually the first multinational to implement a code of conduct. He also advised regularly to Fortune 1000 firm CEOs on labor and human rights in the supply chain. I will now give this webinar to our moderator, Veronica Rubio, and she will start the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tina, for the opportunity. Thank you, everybody, for joining so shortly on time, and thank you very much for this wonderful panel we have today, the Thought Leader webinars FTA. According to the International Confederation of Private Employment Agencies, there are some 11 million workers employed via agencies every day. The largest number of temporary agency workers can be seen in US, Europe, Brazil, Japan, and even South Africa when it comes for 2.2 million workers. Of course, these figures that are given by the International Confederation of Private Employment only include the official labor brokers, and part of this conversation today will be about the unofficial labor brokers. But I think it gives us a little bit of understanding of what are the trends. For example, we can already see that the incidence of temporary workers contracted via agencies does not occur evenly across the labor market, but actually has almost double incidence in low-skilled and young workers. We can also see that in the last 10 years, a clear growth in this pattern or in this model. We can see growth in France, in the Netherlands, Spain, Greece, where agency work has grown rapidly from 0.3 to over 2% of the workforce. We also see the growth in US, where the percentage of temporary agency workers has doubled, accounting for 10% of the employment growth. We also see that trend happening in China, and as a figure given by the ILO, we see that 1/5 of, and that will be 60 million of the 300 million urban employees were dispatch workers, and that has represent doubling the amount of workers in this situation since 2007. And also in the annual survey of industries that India organized manufacturing sector does every year, reveal also sharp increase on contract labor. And we see also a growth from 13% to more than 30% in 2010. Also, we see this growth rate is direct employment is lowering at the same time. So meaning at the same time that the growth of indirect contracting is growing, the direct employment is growing. And last but not least, I wanted to share with you figure that really eye-opened my understanding of this situation. In Chile, for example, a similar survey reported that almost 3% of the firms employed using agencies, that increased almost to 30% when we are talking about large firms with over 200 employees. And the interesting thing that we see is that actually over 15% of those workers were previously hired directly and now have been hired indirectly through agencies. So I want to address all the panelists, Clara, Christina, Patrick, looking or hearing at those data, that growth, those trends. What is your first reaction on these figures? Are we witnessing precarization of employment worldwide, or can you find better explanations to this phenomenon? And I give the floor first to Clara, and then I move it on to the rest of the panel. Clara, what is your first impression about this?
Thanks, Veronica. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank FTA for the invitation to participate in this webinar, and just to say that I'm really honored to share the panel with Christine and Patrick. I'm not really much surprised about these figures, and if I echo what we've heard from private sector, and I don't want to put in others' mouth my own words, and obviously in this panel there are people that I'm better positioned to answer to this question. There is an undeniable need for workers in certain industries in certain countries, and labor mobility has been greater than ever. And there actually, I mean, there was, I think it was a McKinsey study from a couple of years ago that was given figures about what were going to be the labor shortages, and those figures were quite impressive. about the number of workers in lower skill, but also medium skill level, and where will these workers be needed. I can think about many reasons, and obviously some that indicate a precarization, and again, I don't want to blame the companies, but maybe we can also see a will from certain companies to outsource in order to minimize the liability towards the workers. But again, I don't want to speak for the companies themselves, because I think we also need to understand, or I also understand that the production models today with peak seasons in certain industries where the composition and numbers of the workforce may need to change quite rapidly is facilitated. It's something that can be facilitated by labor brokers, and that's why they're there as well. And it is true that often contract workers enjoy worse conditions than those that are, or their equivalents as direct employees, or those are employed as direct employees. But again, this should not necessarily be the case, and I think this is something that we'll go into in the discussion, because it just suffices to recognize the same rights and working conditions for contract workers at the same level of national workers or direct employees.
Excellent, yeah. What do you think, Christina? What is your first impression as a company representative today?
Yes, no, actually I'm not surprised either so much, but of course it's also striking that this is very evidently so also in our countries in the Western world, and we've seen it in Sweden and throughout Europe that this is the case, and we have to meet this in how we work with social responsibility in our supply chains. So, because as Clara was saying, this is the case now, and then what we have to do is to see to that the contracted workers do not face worse working conditions, and that the employer cannot see it that because you are like outsourcing the workers, you still cannot outsource the responsibility of the employees that you have at your workplace. But this is a really big issue also legal-wise, and we come to that question a bit later. But I see it as, for us, as a sourcing company of sourcing in worldwide, the problem is a bit also when the legislation is not following the reality, then there will be more need for private, control mechanisms.
Absolutely. I love that statement that outsourcing employment doesn't mean outsourcing responsibility. Fantastic. Patrick, what is your view?
Oh, thank you very much. First of all, thank you to the FTA for inviting me to this webinar, and I'm very honored to share the panel with two excellent professionals in this topic. I think when we look at the trends, migrant workers is not a new phenomenon. Migrant workers have happened, all throughout the centuries. You just think about history of the United States, you think about southern workers in Europe moving north. And the reason for that is very complex, but primarily driven by economy. People see the opportunity to go and work in a different location, basically to supplement and to make a better living. But when we look at the trend was somewhat slow and is rapidly increasing in a logarithmic fashion. So it's doubled, compared to 10 years ago. So it's got this dramatic drive now. So what are some of the reasons, that make that such a big issue at the moment? I think the first is that there is influencing factors of global access. You think about information which is now available to everybody that clearly shows where opportunities lie. Travel between different locations becomes much easier. Money transfer between locations become much easier, and they all drive the opportunity for workers to go and work somewhere else in a much easier way. I think in addition, labor brokers, have, seen this as a very lucrative business and have multiplied significantly. And within the lucrative business, some labor brokers are very ethical and do exactly what is supposed to be done according to ILO Convention 29, but some of them are frankly highly corrupt. And this is kind of where some of the issues are. In addition, I think we need to think about the trends that happen within employment itself. Direct employment used to be, quite significant in organizations, but at this point in time, we are looking much more at melted employment, where direct labor is supplemented by temporary labor, contract labor, and at once we're zero contract workers. And that's a trend where migrant workers can fit in dramatically well. And so when you combine all of that, you see a significant increase and an explanation for that trend. Why do certain countries, are more prevalent to either be sending countries or receiving countries? I think it has to do with the type of industry and the demand in that country, Malaysia being a high demand country. And then you look at countries which are sending countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. The Philippines, 30% of their GDP is through workforce remittances of people working abroad. That's a significant driver for countries to send workers abroad as well. Finally, we also have to look at temporary situations such as disasters. I know that that's not a popular topic, but when you look at the amount of migrant workers coming out of Nepal before and after the earthquake, there is a significant increase for people to seek economic opportunity abroad.
Thank you, Patrick. I want to pick up. Sorry. Thank you, Patrick. I want to pick up one of the sentences you said. So labor brokers are a lucrative business, but and some of them, they are very ethical, but some of them are not. And that will be for me a question to Clara now, because indeed not all labor brokers are represent at risk from the perspective of companies' due diligence in identifying who is who and how they are related in the supply chain. But Clara, will you help us to understand in which circumstances it's advisable for companies to become extra diligent to detect or monitor and possibly remove labor brokers or unethical labor brokers from their supply chains? Are there any indicators out there that you could convey as advice to companies that are listening to this webinar?
Mm-hmm. First, it's true that in the past few years we've witnessed sort of like a demonization of the labor industry. But I think it's wrong to say that all labor brokers represent a risk and that we should all move into direct employment or it's or any of that sort. It's not about labor broker or non-labor broker, is about how they perform their work, and it's about recognizing unethical recruitment practices. And moving into what you mentioned about what are the indicators, or just to explain, when we're talking about unethical recruitment practices, what we're talking about are issues such as charging fees to job seekers, and by these we do not always necessarily mean a cost to job seekers or to workers that is purely represented as a fee for recruitment, but we can also be talking about charging other costs, just transport or accommodation during, during the transfer, the time where the worker arrives or meets the other workers before they go to deployment. It's about paying for pre-departure orientation courses. It can also be requests to lodge deposits to ensure the job. And these can be sometimes, it's not very clear. It's not like sometimes it's not about paying upfront, but sometimes it's then somehow hide it in, or sometimes they don't pay, but then they've asked to repay back through their wages. We're talking also, when we talk about unethical recruitment practices, we're talking about also confiscating passport and other workers' valuable without giving workers a clear process by which they can recover their personal documentation. We're also talking about misrepresentation of the working conditions in the contract, or the absence of a contract, or a contract that is not written in a language that the worker understands, or even in the case of migrant workers, it's often the case that the migrant worker is asked to sign a contract just like at the time, basically like one day before they're taking the plane to go into the deployment or to go finally to the user enterprise side, or even at arrival, and then they're faced with a contract that doesn't represent or doesn't give the same conditions that were explained at the time that they sign up for the job. So these are all practices that we recognize as unethical practices, and that we recognize as indicators that further diligence must be exercised. Of course, it's not easy, and it's always a hard evaluation to understand what it is, what is not, what is the fee, what is not a fee, in terms of, especially regarding different countries with different legislation, regulatory regimes for recruitment agents. But we also think we need to understand, to establish an evaluation of indicators and evaluation of their practices. We also need to understand and make a difference of the mandate of the labor broker. So while some are performing solely recruitment functions, that is the placement of workers and their direct employment relationship with the supplier, in other cases these recruitment intermediaries are also employers on record, and the supplier is just the end user enterprise in the relationship with the worker. And in this case, when we try to identify red flags, we also need to look for issues such as the withholding of wages, such as when a contract established to onerous clauses for the termination of the contract. So that is when the worker can leave their working relationship, when accommodation conditions are not good, when the conditions and payment of overtime is not in accordance to law, when there's no access to grievance mechanisms, and when there is not the right, when these workers have not the right to be unionized, for example, just to give some like a broad spectrum of different indicators or red flags. But I would say that to start with, companies should really need to understand and map their labor supply chain. So this is, what is your labor supply chain composed of? And even before that, what is the composition of your workforce? Because I'm not sure that while many of the companies that are listening today are very much aware of these issues and the composition of the workforce, where their workers are coming from, what's the percentage of both migrant workers and agency or contract workers in their supply chain. This is not always the case. And actually, I would say more than often, it is not the case. In the first case, in identifying or mapping your labor supply chain, it's about identifying all the elements that compose your labor supply chain, and this is crucial to understand the risks. So it's important to ask questions to your labor, to your recruitment agents, to your recruitment intermediaries about, and your suppliers. So to your supplier, do you do direct recruitment? If not, who are the recruitment intermediaries that you're working with? Is there any due diligence exercise in choosing the recruitment they work with? Do they, the countries where these recruiters are established, or the countries that companies are hiring from, are these recruitment intermediaries licensed? Is there a regulatory regime in the country of origin, or in the country where recruiters are recruiting their workers? Does the regime allow for example, charging fees to job seekers? If they do, in which conditions? And is the supplier doing, if, for example, a company is establishing a no fees for job seekers policy, what is the supplier doing to implement this policy, even though the recruiter is allowed in principle to charge fees to job seekers? So, and secondly, it's also about understanding the recruitment intermediary chain on its own, and the fact that diligence should be exercised before this sort of like first recruiter. And this is understanding who is my recruiter working with. Are there any subcontractors? Are these subcontractors licensed or not? What is the level of informality of my labor supply chain? Because very often when we try to map and understand, basically the question is, so where are my workers coming from, and what is their journey? How does the journey look like? And where, if there has been any illegality or any abuse of the worker during this journey. So you will see that maybe you have a first labor recruiter that is compliant to the law, that is licensed, everything looks fine, but it may be the case that this labor recruiter is working with somehow at some level of informality of or informal recruiters down their own supply chain, and it may be the case that while your recruiter, direct employee recruiter, is not charging fees have been charged along the journey for these workers. So by the time the worker arrives at the deployment site, he's already been indebted. So we go back to the first list of indicators, and we need to see and establish measures to remediate rather than to prevent. So these for me are in the broad sense, what are the indicators, what is that we should be looking for. And again, I like to stress the first thing to do is to understand the composition of your labor, of your workforce, and the composition of your labor supply chains, for then understanding where abuses have been committed and being able to take decisions based on that information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to hear that somehow your advice is also echoing what we say at VSEI on the due diligence aspects and some of the indicators you mentioned. We also stress that to our companies, but actually I know that Christina, your company has been confronted with a few specific cases on unethical labor brokers in your supply chain. So I will be, and I think the audience will be delighted to hear this practical experience and how did you find out, first of all, and how did you go about it, a little bit in the lines of Clara's explanation.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we have had some cases the last couple of years, mainly in Thailand, which is one of the countries where labor brokers is an epidemic. It's a problem because the brokers are also often unethical in their behavior and how they work down to the home countries of the migrant workers. And then also I can mention cases in Malaysia, and of course we also worked with seeing into the situation in Sweden in the fresh fruits and vegetables, and also in Italy for tomatoes, for canned tomatoes. But I can especially go into some details for one of the cases in Thailand and the Malaysian case. And as many of you might know, the Thai food industry is very dependent on migrant workers, mainly from Myanmar. And then the cases which we came to know about is through the NGOs. The Finwatch reports have been very important in scrutinizing and researching the supply chains, because very often this is in our sub-supply chain, so it's not so easy to find within normal social auditing in the first layer of the production. But for this specific case, which I was going to tell about, it was also labor brokers who were employing, like Clara was telling about. It's one thing when you have a recruiter for a labor broker and then you have direct employment, but here it was a indirect employment through a labor broker, which was revealed as having very unethical conditions for the migrant workers. They had been cheated in different ways on the on what job conditions they would have, and they were indebted to, they have charged them with large fees, illegal high fees, and so on. And then immediately when we come to know about this, we started to have the dialogue with our supplier and said that, and one first thing was we cannot really, or we have come to the conclusion we cannot like force our suppliers that they should have direct employment, because this is not the case even in Sweden, but we can of course force them that it has to be ethical and legal in the recruitment. So, but in this case, we actually recommended them to have direct employment because the risk would be minimized in a better way. And we saw from Finnwatch report that this agency was actually not, up to standard. But they were a bit. They said that, well, we will manage and we will make changes so that it will be legal conditions, and we already also from the beginning decided that of course we will stay and make sure that there will be improvements for the workers. We don't want the situation that the workers will just be kicked out. Then actually it was again Finnwatch going back to we were also there, we were visiting, and there was a special investigation from BCI, and but again Finnwatch was going back with Migrant Workers' Rights Network, a local NGO working for the migrant workers, and again after some months when the situation had not become better, we again said, well, you have to make direct employment, and that was actually then later the case. They took on the direct employment, and they helped the migrant workers, the same migrant workers, to get the legal papers, and then we also came there again, and we made a round table discussion with Migrant Workers' Rights Network, and we promoted welfare committees with migrant workers in the welfare committees. So yeah, and finally Finnwatch and Migrant Workers' Rights Network went back again, and as what we understand in interviews, now the situation was much better, and they were like content with the situation was obviously much better. So this is just an example on how you, most of the time you need to put quite a lot of engagement in when the cases are there, and you have to see to that the workers are not victimized. And when it's in the sub-supply chain, I mean deeper down in the supply chain, it's more easy and a bigger risk that the workers are actually the ones who are victimized. Because someone in the chain always think that it's easier to just get rid of the problem by finishing the business, let's say. And then it's really a problem, how can we remedy the workers afterwards? And in the case of Malaysia, it was actually a BCI audit, which I'm really happy to say, because it's not always, as I said, that audits are finding these issues, unfortunately. But I think that auditors become more aware, and in the Malaysian case, this audit showed very good grading on most of the levels. It's we have been there, it has been very, it's a good supplier in many ways, but they got E, which is a very low, unacceptable level in the performance area forced labor. And it was because they made interviews with migrant workers from many different Asian countries, which is normal in the Malaysian industry, that you have migrant workers from many other Asian countries. And they were shown in these interviews that they were deeply indebted, because they had paid different fees to get the work, not only fees, but like transportation, very much. So they had around maybe 10 months up to 1 year indebtedness, so they had to work first year or so to even get to pay back. And this was of course not acceptable, and then we started a process to get the supplier to understand this and make an action plan. And this was actually quite interesting. The first reaction was like, well, but we only did what everyone else is doing, and according to Malaysian, you know, we went through the agencies that we have to do. You know, in Malaysia there are some official agencies and the way you do it. But we said, well, it's not okay that that they have it. They put all these costs on the employee, and we introduced the idea of employer pay principle, and we put them in contact with the IOM and the the IRIS project, and said that you must come up with a labor hiring policy which is according to the employer pay principle. And after first round they came back with a policy which was not so good, but then we took it one round more, and actually now they agreed to take on almost all costs for the employment of the migrant workers. So it's for Malaysian praxis, I would say it's quite best practice. And then we also had the discussion of if they need to go back and remedy the workers who are in debt. But right now we have not come to, they are doing some part of it, but not, repay everything from. But for the new employment, it will be in a much better way for the workers.
Oh, brilliant, Christina. Thank you so much for sharing that very practical experience in both cases, in Thailand and in Malaysia. I'm hearing some key elements. I heard before from Clara mentioning the importance of proper access to grievance mechanisms. I hear now from you involving or making sure that there is a welfare workers committee. All those components were included in the revision of the BSCI Code of Conduct in 2014. In addition, I think, and Patrick will correct me if I'm wrong, but from my knowledge, the BSCI Code of Conduct is the only code of conduct that I'm aware of that integrates, specifically mentions precarious employment as a very key element to tackle in this, in both BSCI participants as well as their business partners. Patrick, how do you assess, what is with your experience in other codes, and how do you assess this element in our code of conduct? Do you think that makes a difference in the way our system works?
Right, thank you, Veronica. The BSCI code, in my assessment, is unique in calling out no precarious employment. It highlights, like no other initiative, the focus that there is precarious employment, and that part of the due diligence and the efforts that must be made in order to be in compliance with the BSCI principles, that this is a key component. In addition, there are other elements in the BSCI code which are unique on supply chain and collaboration with the business partners to ensure that good working conditions are met. Nevertheless, BSCI is not the only initiative that is focusing on the issue of migrant workers, which is more than just precarious employment. There's also links to bonded labor. So there are initiatives such as the EICC that do have clear definitions of employer pays principle in their audit criteria, but not necessarily at the code level. So yes, it does make a difference that this is highlighted. Is it easy to assess? I would say it's actually very difficult to assess, and it's a very complex area. I'm going to echo what the two esteemed panelists have already said. I think we need to understand the complexity. I think first is you need to understand who is actually at the site, whether that's a farm or a factory. Where do they come from? which is actually quite critical. I think the next level to understand is actually how do they get to your workplace, and there starts a level of complexity, because the way that you could hire, and this is not the type of contract which is temporary or not, but the way that you hire people can be through an agent or a labor broker within the country, potentially a labor broker in a sending country. You could hire direct to overseas, although that is absolutely exceptional, or don't underestimate that you could do local hire of migrant workers, but they actually are in the country through an agent. There's some interesting examples of even Syrian workers in Turkey that come into Turkey but actually through an agent, so they are indebted, except that they present themselves as a local hire. I think it also would be interesting to understand, as already been mentioned, that the supply chain of migrant workers, which is not a nice way of calling it, is very complex. And I think unless you understand the complexity of the different levels in that supply chain, it's very hard to assess where it can go wrong. So I'm going to take about 30 seconds to kind of explain what a typical migrant worker supply chain could look like, which might help understand the different levels. Recruiting happens in villages of countries which are destined as ascending countries. So think about Nepal, think about Bangladesh, think about Pakistan. And the local recruiter is actually referred to as a bullhead. He is a local agent, he's an individual, he's usually not licensed, and he seeks out people that are willing to work abroad to seek the economic opportunity. But he's picking people who are poor enough to actually be able to go and are willing to go, but not so poor that they couldn't pay for some kind of fee. So there already it's going wrong. The bullhead, the local village recruiter, and then basically passes on the worker to a regional recruiter, who will pass on the worker to a national recruiter, who will pass on the worker to a sending recruiter. And usually the sending recruiter is probably the first level of visibility that you're going to get in the supply chain. Most of these sending recruiters have to have licensees by law, local law, but they are only able by law to send workers abroad. If in the case of Malaysia, etc., you need to have a receiving recruiter. You need to have an agent that sits in Malaysia that is actually receiving the workers, and that is probably the recruiter or the organization that you as a company will actually have a contract with. The other thing to understand is that agents and labor brokers do not generally specifically recruit just for you or for a specific sector. They try to move as many people as they can, although that's actually against the law. Pooling and general recruiting is not legal, but yet most of them do this, which brings to the issue of legal enforceability. Legal enforceability is hard because it's cross borders. So the receiving recruiter can only be held accountable for what they do in Malaysia, and the sending recruiter out of Nepal can only be held accountable for what they do in Nepal, usually. There are some exceptions, but they're very minor. So when you understand that complexity, you can then really kind of begin to understand where things go wrong. And as the previous panelists have mentioned, the only way that you're truly going to get to, where does it go wrong, is to have very frequent communications and interactions with your work population. That poses a challenge of language and interaction. I'm glad that the BSA audit picked up an issue, but if you're in Malaysia, if an audit team comes in, they probably would have to be fluent in at least 4, 5, 6 different languages in order to be able to speak to the migrant population to do a good job. So it is very difficult, but communication and grievance systems and clarity make it easier. I think it's also critical that you start looking at, you know, exactly what amount of money is being sent home, and therefore direct payments or remittances is critical. If payment goes through an agent, even if the agent is the employer, the risk becomes much higher. And as well, you know, you need to look at, you know, what kind of information have workers been given about, you know, the conditions of work prior leaving the country as well as arriving in the new country. But please do not underestimate the fear that some of these workers might have, even if, you know, things go fairly well. Remember that in that supply chain there are individuals, which are not organizations, which are unlicensed, that do this purely because it's a lucrative business. The more levels that you have in that supply chain, the higher the risk. Some of these individuals will threaten the families back in the home villages by saying, yes, I understand that you know, I facilitated work abroad, but if you want to see your son or daughter back here after 3 years, you owe me an additional amount of money. These are real situations and you need to be aware of those. So what can you do? You can make sure that you understand your population. You can make sure that you have frequent communication with them, dialogue and grievance mechanisms available. You can make sure that you understand the amount of money that they are being paid, how that ends up back home. If there are any discrepancies along the way, you know that you've got a risk. You can also ensure that, you know, the recruiting process, if you go through an agent, even if it's a local hire, is as short as possible. The shorter the chain, the less risk.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I have a few questions also, but I see that the audience is giving us a lot of good and interesting questions that I would definitely like you as the experts address. I see here a question from Adil Mogud, and well, the question is, in your view as a panelist, and probably Clara and Patrick, is there lack of regulation in prosecuting the illegal labor brokers in your view? Is that the reason that maybe there is not sufficient enforcement of the existing laws or adequate provisions to protect and support human trafficking in Thailand and Malaysia, for example? So it will also be, actually it addressed the three of you from different angles, and I almost feel that it's a rhetorical question, but I want to hear what the panelists have to say here. I give the floor first to Clara, ladies first, Clara, Christina, and Patrick.
Thank you, Veronica. I mean, I totally agree with the question. Yes, the regulation of recruitment intermediaries is is not the same everywhere, and this is also why there has been a call or a need for initiatives such as the IRIS initiative, the IRIS Multi-Stakeholder Certification System, or for even the ILO as well, to put down a guidance on what are benchmarks of recruitment, and for many others, also from an industry association point of view, to establish their own codes of conduct, what a good recruiter should look like. And again, I mean, also from our, now with my new hat as a human rights officer at the High Commission for Human Rights, and in my work with the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking, this is an issue that we take with us, and in our direct contact with governments, this is something that we raise. that we need better regulation. We need, also because companies need better regulation, they want better, as I think Christina mentioned it, it's, you want to be working on a regulatory environment that protects you as well, meaning that it's clear that your business partners abide as well to the same rules that you abide to. And again, this is something that we take with us in our conversation with governments to call them to enforce those international instruments that they've ratified, but as well to enforce regulatory regimes that allow to create a level playing field for those that are doing the right thing already. Hello, can you?
Sorry, I feel so much at home that I forget to unlock my microphone, please.
I thought I was alone.
Sorry, Christina, what would be your view? Something to add here?
Well, maybe just shortly that I agree that there is need for better regulation, both within the EU, I would say, because when we looked into this in Sweden with the migrant workers coming to the Swedish fruits and vegetables category, it's a kind of a grayscale way, which is of course used by the employers when it comes to like which conditions should be granted to an employee. And also thinking about the Thai context, about the migrant workers there, they are in constant change and semi-legal status, and this gives only room for issues all the time, which is then passed on to the private actors so it's needed, of course it's needed a better regulations, yes.
Including protection for victims. Will that be right, Patrick?
Well, it's a complex question. I think we need to unpack this a little bit. I think first and foremost, I think on the labor agents and employment agents themselves, the legislative requirements vary dramatically from country to country. And let's look at another level of complexity, which is actually enforceability. Country laws apply to agents within the country in most cases. I'll talk a little bit later about some exceptions to that. But again, so an agent in Bangladesh has legal obligations within Bangladesh, but what happens to the workers once when they send abroad becomes very difficult to enforce. Supranational or international enforcement and calibration of those legal requirements becomes very difficult. Second, I think that legislation is full of what I would call significant gaps with regard to worker protection. I think workers generally are protected when they are local nationals, but when they are in the country for a limited period of time, the legislation is at best unclear or lacking in most cases. And in some cases, as in the case of Mauritius, which is actually quite a bad example, is that there is no protection whatsoever, and any risk to stability actually means deportation. So you can go from nothing exists, it's unclear, to really bad situations. I think lastly, there are ethical recruiters out there. I've got a list of those. I'm happy to know these organizations personally, but they face a very hard time, primarily because of the quite bad actors and the level of collusion and corruption that exists between those bad actors and government civil servants. Think of it this way, just do a quick calculation in your heads. Imagine that you're an agent in Bangladesh. You charge Bangladeshi workers $2,000 and you deploy 10,000 Bangladeshis every single year. How much is your income as an agent? Quite a lucrative business, I would say. And if then local government officials collude and are corrupt, it just makes enforceability very difficult. Lastly, even if you want to enforce, enforcement can only happen through a court of law. And in the court of law, you would have to submit evidence. And evidence of issues that happen outside the country is very difficult. And there's, again, the evidence and the proof is going to become very difficult to make a court case actually stick.
Thank you, Patrick. I think we are heading to the end of the webinar. I feel we could be talking for hours about this fascinating topic, including the questions that have been addressed by the audience, all very, very interesting, and that will require deeper analysis. I think I still have the time to ask you, the three of you, a single question that could sort of wrap up and give us some light for the future. We are all aware of the changes in terms of legislations, and I would like to hear your opinion in which way do you think legislation such as the Modern Slavery Act, the California Transparency Act, or the Gun Master Act could help companies to carry on or structure in a different way their due diligence process in this particular context of unethical labor brokers. Can we see there an additional tool to support companies? And just for a change, I give the floor to Patrick, but only if he promised to be very, very strict to the point, and we have still some time left to wrap up. Thank you, Patrick. Your floor is yours.
Thank you, Veronica. They're all very different legal instruments of enforcement. However, these legal instruments are not new. They are rather clarifications of already existing laws. So when you think about the California Act of 2010, it actually is a federal enforcement of a law of 2000. There are general enforcement legislation out there that you can tap into, including the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977 in the United States. But legislation only will make a difference. The only thing I would say is that what truly makes things shift next to legislation is economics. And I think economics resides with you as users of migrant workers. I understand that this is complex. I understand that this is a very big topic, but don't be afraid to do your part and keep it simple. Make sure that you take part in joint initiatives that look at agents, because agents work across sectors. Make sure you understand your workforce, as we already said. Make sure you understand their supply chain. Make sure that you have pre-departure and post-arrival training. Make sure you've got good grievance mechanisms. Look at direct money transfers, so money doesn't get lost along the way. Make sure that you've got demand letters with your agents to enforce the law which is actually upon you. Make sure that you got a good contract. So there are lots of things that you could practically do to make a difference today, and that economic change together with legislation will move this needle.
Fantastic. Christina, will you have some views on these legislations?
Yes, or no. I'm thinking that I already said my points on legislation, that I do think that it's really needed, but it's like Patrick says, that in the meanwhile and with the legislation we have, we as private companies, we can do much better in actually knowing our supply chain and the labor recruitment, it's like we almost have not started yet to look into the whole issue of labor recruitment issues down in the supply chains. And I would want to add what I have given as practical examples and what you can do when you find cases. That is one thing, but the thing that we can do as companies when we source is that we ask all these questions in risk areas, in risk countries for these issues like Malaysia, Thailand, Italy. Yeah, first of course you need to identify these markets that you source from where this is prevalent, and then you ask all these questions before so that you get suppliers that already have you know, ethical recruitment in place. You try to choose the ones that can really verify that they have better recruitment, ethical recruitment processes in place, and in that way you can you know, change in some way, and you promote the ones that are doing this in a better way. And then of course you have to work with the ongoing business partners that already have these issues within the supply chain at the same time. And for our suppliers there, I think within BCI we need to be better in, you know, informing exactly what they should do, how they should go about. Guidance is needed because this is like changing industry praxis. Maybe to say something about legislation, I'm really hoping that this new legislation in Thailand, which is actually talking about employer pay principle for recruitment, is going to make change in Thailand. But that will only be done, as Patrick said, if we also say that this should be used. So, yeah, what I would say. Thank you.
Brilliant. Clara?
Well, I feel like it's best would be to finish with Christina's word. It's super encouraging to hear a company talking in these terms. Regarding the legislation like California Transparency Act or the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, I believe they have had a great impact already, even though these are legislation that only request disclosure of efforts, not the effort itself. But I think it's been very interesting, the shift in companies' behavior, the moment that they had to say publicly what they were doing about these issues about eliminating trafficking in the supply chain, training, due diligence exercise. And I think now maybe it's too early for the modern slavery, and we'll see as well with the federal acquisition regulation in the US. It will be time soon to determine to what extent this is enough, or we shall move into more strict, not more strict regulation, but regulation that goes a little bit beyond just the disclosure that demands a specific action to be taken.
Excellent. So I have 3 takeaways at least, or food for thought for the next months, what I have learned today. First, from you, I heard a lot about companies should understand the composition of the workforce and understand better the composition of their supply chain. I heard also that although the situation is very complex, that we should not get discouraged because there is a lot of work that we can already do. There were given few indicators on what the company should be looking at when doing their due diligence in the supply chain, and that also legislation goes hand by hand with economic goodwill, and that you are not alone on that. Don't pretend to do this alone, and try to join initiatives that take into consideration labor brokers and that give you the necessary tools to have more transparency in the way workers are recruited. I give now the floor. I want to again thank you all the 3 panelists for giving this, for sharing their experience, their expertise, their knowledge with all of us. Also, thank you the attendees for expressing your interest, also posing the questions that you have provide us to the panelists. And I give the floor to Tina to close out. Thank you very much, Tina, as well.
Thank you, Veronica. And thank you also, Patrick, Clara, and Christina for this very interesting discussion. I think what has become very clear is that it is very important also for companies to know what is actually happening in their supply chain. And just for your information, FTA also organizes free workshops for the members to actually understand this better. So we do have workshops focusing on due diligence and also focusing on grievance mechanism, where we will actually help and assist the members on how to actually have a closer look on their own supply chain. So this actually wraps up the FTA Thought Leadership Webinar Series for 2016. We had 4 webinars in total. Earlier on this year, we had the webinar about the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. Later, we had the webinar about migrant workers in Turkey. And the third one was about untangling the web of chemical legislation issues and trends. Of course, there will be more webinars to come in 2017, so please stay tuned for that. We can already confirm 2 upcoming webinars that will be organized in the early part of 2017. Those are about women's empowerment in the Chinese factories and also a webinar on the water and textiles industry. I want to thank you all for being here during the webinar and also for your very interesting questions. If you have any more questions or you want to have more information about us, please send an email to info@fta-intl.org. I thank you all for joining.